Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And let me start off by wishing all of you a happy and healthy and successful 2024 ahead. And we're starting off today with our first event for 2024 here at the Center for Global Development. And the event we're going to be doing today is a book launch. And the book focuses on scaling up development impact. And most of you who are online already are familiar with the topic, but I think it's really a very good topic with which to start the year because there are so many problems in development, so many challenges which are large scale, for which we have the technology, we have the solutions to be able to make progress. And there are lots of examples of solutions being applied to address these challenges, but they don't seem to reach often the scale that is needed to really have impact. And so today we have the opportunity to listen to the work that's been done by three people who've been looking for many years at this topic first, and who are the co-authors of this book, Isabel Guerrero, Siddhant Gokhale, and Jossie Fahsbender. And all three of them are with us today for this event. Isabel's going to give us an overview of the book. Isabel is somebody who I've known for many, many years. We worked together in the World Bank many years ago. But over the past few years, she's been both practicing this in terms of helping grassroots organizations, trying to reach scaling up and impact, but also looking more at the academic end of this work by teaching a course on this at Harvard, and bringing the two together along with her co-authors in this book leads to a lot of insights, which I hope you'll find of interest too. And then we have a panel of three people who have also been thinking very hard about this from very different perspectives, and I'll introduce them after we've had Isabel talk to us and give us the highlights and main conclusions of her work. So Isabel, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Hannah, I think you need to...
I think, Isabel, you need to unmute your, you start your video, I think. There you go. And then we'll see.
There we are.
Perfect. Great.
Great. Thank you, Masood, and thank you so much for CGD for hosting this. CGD has an amazing reach. I can see that already we're over 100 people today. So delighted with the interest on scaling up. As Masood mentioned, I worked in the World Bank for over 30 years and really worked at scale for the last 5 years as a vice president for South Asia. The portfolio I managed was of around $36 billion. So, and also working with India and South Asia, we really worked at scale with loans that were 500 million, $1 billion, $1.5 billion. So it was really working at scale. But during that time, I realized that there were many questions that could not be handled from the top down. Questions about children learning how to read and write, the teacher showing up at school, open defecation. There were a lot of these wicked development problems that could not be solved from the top down. Yet, both living in Mexico and then living in India, realized that there were these amazing organizations who, as Masood said, had the answers of how to do this. But the challenge was how to scale. So there was this missing middle between the top down and the bottom up in development that I really felt was what I wanted to do after graduating from the World Bank. So as Masood said, I taught this course from scratch, very much based on the work that both Johannes Lin had done in Brookings and what Larry Cooley had done in MSI, and then built from that and worked at the same time after funding Imago with amazing grassroots organizations who were wanting to scale, sort of test driving these frameworks. And this is the result that you see in the book after 10 years of this book. So the part one of the book is an analytic framework, understanding both the definitions, the evolution of this in development, but also how to think about scaling up. And also, why is it so difficult to scale up? Scale up is not just about growing, but it's really a transformation process. And there are many failures that happen that explain why it's so difficult to scale up. The part one talks about this framework, plus also help us understand, are we scaling up within a system, or do we have to change the system in order to scale up? So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book goes into different domains, to the private sector, to the government, and to the donors. On the private sector, of course, the private sector is the best at scaling up, but it doesn't usually reach the poor. All the promise of the fortune at the base of the pyramid that we had with Prada had actually not been found or met. So the private sector is the best. There's a lot to learn from the private sector to scale up. And the unicorns with these tech companies and startups that we have had in the last 15 years have really changed the way that we think about scaling, not just in terms of the speed at which scale is now reached, but and the magnitude of the scale, but also in terms of the methods and the agile methods, the rapid pivoting, learning, failing. There's a lot that we can learn for the government and for donors. So we really go into this chapter illustrating what we have used in Imago, the nonprofit that I founded 10 years ago, what we have used from the tech companies, the tech startups with grassroots that works very well for scaling. The second chapter in that part of the book is about the government. It's the most important player in scaling. The longest reach, the longest distribution networks are those of the government, yet it many times fails also to scale. So we go into two ways of scaling, and I'm sure Veronica is going to get into that, two ways of scaling, one with an innovation outside the government that is sort of is done by nonprofits, civil society, social enterprises, and then it's scaled within the government. Or the other route, which is innovations that are done within the government, like Oportunidades, when Santiago Levy designed all this within the government. What does it take to be able to have these innovations eventually scale when you start from inside? So we look at those two sides. And the third chapter in that part is about donors. There's a story of unexploited potential, and I'm sure Johannes is going to talk about that. There's been a big change in the philanthropic interest in scale and in development. And there are many players right now in the development, in the funding continuum that we talk about, yet those players are not coordinating among themselves. Scaling up is not something that has, as a concept, is clear in many of the agencies who work at scale. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done on that. Johannes, Larry, and Richard Cole are working on this, a 2-year project, which is really promising. So that is part 2. Part 3 is getting into how do we scale at the base of the pyramid, the most fascinating of all the scaling up. We start with one chapter, a full chapter on BRAC, because they are the masters at scaling. They reach 135 million people in Bangladesh. They really are the only ones that have sort of filled this missing middle in a real way. And they are very artful about the way that they do it. They have social enterprises that are profitable, of which they use 50% to reinvest in the social programs, and 50% they are invested in the social enterprise themselves to grow. And so that has been the secret of BRAC, and the way that they test and they pivot very much like the private sector, and then scale, train, replicate. So the first chapter of that part on how to scale at the base of the pyramid is on BRAC. The second chapter is on social enterprises. social enterprises, we think, are the new development tool, just like public-private partnerships were a development tool 2 decades ago, a new tool. We think today this is social enterprises. They have the capacity to innovate, the capacity to fail quickly, that you do not have inside the government. And also they have the focus on social impact that the private sector doesn't necessarily have. And so that chapter is about social enterprises, understanding what they are, looking at different examples across the world, and learning from that experience. And the third chapter is a chapter we developed with the World Bank in East Africa, which is about how do you, if you're a policymaker, what is the ecosystem that you need to think about promoting and developing for social enterprises to really scale? And so that's a very rich chapter for all of you who are interested in working really at the grassroots, at the base of the pyramid. And last but not least, we think that part 4 is a really important contribution of this book, which is about evaluations. Evaluations as a journey of meaning making that accompanies this transformative process of scaling up. And there we talk about the fact that RCTs are probably one of the most important innovations in economics that have happened in the last, again, 20 years. And that they have an important place in development and in scaling up, but that there are many other tools that are needed to accompany the scaling up process. And I'm really delighted that John Floretta is with us today, because he's in the community of practice on scaling up and in JPAL and has thought a lot about this as well. So I'm very happy he's here. So in a nutshell, in a very condensed nutshell, that is what the book is all about. It covers a wide range of topics, and it incorporates a lot of sort of learnings from both teaching and applying it to grassroots over the last 10 years. And I really hope that it's going to help any of you who are interested in this wonderful challenge, which is to really find solutions that many of which are already there, that can work at the scale, at the magnitude of the problem at hand. So with that, Masood, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And I'm just going to turn my video on so that I can be seen as well. There you go. So I think thank you for giving us that overview of the different parts of the book and how it all hangs together. And in doing so, you've actually made my job easier, which is that you already identified our 3 panelists. And I'm going to turn to them now, and starting with Johannes Lin, and then going to John Floretta, and then to Veronica Zavala. And let me just say a word about each. You said that, Johannes, you have been you are currently the co-chair of the Scaling Up community, and I want to come to you and really to talk a bit more about that. But just to say, this is a topic on which you have been very much focused, really, pretty much since you left the World Bank and or even at the World Bank. So it'll be an interesting journey in some ways to hear from you. John, I'll come to you after Johannes, if I may, and really to pick up on the last set of things which Isabel was talking about to start with, which is this whole issue of how do we measure impact as we're scaling up, and also to what extent can one do the sort of adaptive evaluations that enable the process of scaling up to change and adapt and change direction, because it's not so obvious at the beginning of the scaling up process for any grassroots organization to have a very clear linear path that would lead them to where they think they will be. So that would be great. And Veronica, if I might then come to you after that, which is you have the great experience of having been involved in looking at this set of issues from within a government. You know, you were a minister in the government in Peru, but also you have been in one of the multilateral organizations in IDB, managing the program of work for the IDB. So when you look at it from the 2 sides, and I want to particularly come to you to say, well, how well are these established I don't know what is the right term for them, the sort of traditional machines for supporting development, government and multilateral development banks. How well are they prepared to connect with the new opportunities that are offered by, say, social enterprises and the like? I mean, to what extent are their mechanisms and instruments and culture geared to supporting scaling up outside their own operations? So they're very focused on what they do for themselves, but to what extent can they help the process in the broader ecosystem? And any thoughts you have on that would be great. But Johannes, if I might come to you first, and really my question to you would be to help us put this book a little bit in the broader context of where the scaling up conversation now stands. Where does this add value? But also, where do we see the sort of next steps of going forward? And that would be, I think, very helpful for everyone.
Thanks, Masood. It's great to join this conversation, and it's great to see everybody on screen. Now, the reason why I'm so happy about being here today is, among other things, is because Isabel and her colleagues, you wrote the book that I always wanted to write, but I haven't written it for various reasons, and not least because, having read the book now, I realize you did a much better job than I ever could have done. So congratulations, it's fantastic. And I really was very happy when I had the book in my hands and was able to take another good hard look at it. But, aside from that, it's most importantly, really, I think it's a book that is needed to be written right now, because we've had, say, roughly 20 years of evolving work by many of us and in this panel, but also beyond, on scaling. And we're now finally, I think, seeing increasing attention paid to this topic by many development leaders and organizations. If you listen to Ajay Banga's annual meeting speech in Marrakesh just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, it was all about sustainable impact at scale. I understand IDB's new strategy has the title Scale and Impact. And recent high-level reports on development and climate finance and NDB reforms, while they all still, if I may say so, still pushed the notion that, yes, we need more money, and we clearly need more money, but they also realize and explicitly mention that we really have to also make sure that we get more sustainable impact for whatever money we spend. And finally, our scaling community practice that both John and Isabel belong to and have been extremely helpful over the years has expanded from about 40 members 8 or 9 years ago when Larry Cooley and I founded the community practice to some 4,000 now. So clearly there is a wave here. And Isabel, your book is really timed perfectly as far as I'm concerned. It basically pulls together what we know about scaling and provides a fresh and a very imaginative approach to the opportunity and, yes, very much the challenges that arise when you try to pursue sustainable impact at scale. And I strongly recommend the book to all of the listeners who are here today because it's comprehensive and yet not overwhelming, which is quite a trick, I have to say. It's technically sound and yet very accessible for non-technical readers. It delves very deeply into a number of development challenges and issues, but at the same time, it has actionable recommendations for the practitioners. Actually, I particularly like the fact that the book asks the reader to ask the right questions rather than prescribing the right answers. The answers always depend on context. And so it's really important that we ask the right questions. And the book also gives us some tools to how to answer it, but it doesn't tell us what is the answer, because that, as I said, really will depend on who you are, in what environment you're working, and so on. Now, if you don't have the time to read the whole book, I strongly recommend you at least read the first part 1, the first 3 chapters, and take a look at the takeaway sections, which are extremely helpful, pulling together at the end of each chapter what sort of the chapter is all about and what are the main messages. I think with that, you already have made a good start, and you probably won't stop because the book is so wonderful to read. Now, Isabel and Masood have asked me to add a few words about a particular area that the book touches upon or is about in chapter 6. Isabel already mentioned. It's about the funders who support development and climate change action. And the title is Funders as Enablers of Scale or to Scale. Now, the book notes that funders potentially play an important role in supporting scaling, and I couldn't agree more. Finance often, maybe even always, is a critical constraint. And so if we don't have finance, yeah, it's going to be difficult to invest. So the right kind of finance at the right time is a very important facilitator of scaling. But in addition, as Isabel and her colleagues also point out, funders have a very important role potentially to play as key intermediaries. That is an important function. Actually, the book separately explains why intermediaries are needed. And these intermediaries are often missing. So funders actually end up being intermediaries to help build capacity and reform policy, help form coalitions and partnerships for change, to help bringing in relevant international experience, and ensure effective use of evidence for improved outcomes. So funders can play and should play a very important role in supporting scaling. But as the book also points out, funders often, in the way they operate, are actually obstacles to scaling. They focus on flashy innovations without adequate attention to scaling what works. They focus on transferring what works in one place to another without adequate attention to figuring out how the new context matters. They rely on off-budget funding, special purpose project implementation units, and external expertise rather than on helping build better budget practice, administrative capacity, and local expertise. Of course, the new localization agenda that some agencies are focusing on is clearly an important initiative in the right direction. The funders and their monitoring evaluation systems focus on delivering narrow results of one-off projects rather than on using projects to build foundations for sustainable impact at scale or pathways towards that impact. They support policy change, but they don't often follow up with support for implementation. And in a highly fragmented aid architecture, they worry about their own brand, planting their flag literally on their quote-unquote projects, and not enough about building lasting partnerships with other funders to support not only larger time-bound projects, but scaling pathways over longer time horizons. However, and let me end on this, fortunately, the change is underway here also. We in the Scaling Community of Practice have this 2-year project, a action research initiative underway on mainstreaming scaling into funder organizations. And we found that many funders now, in fact, are focusing on how to support scaling more systematically. We're working with 10+ funders so far on assessing their own practices and plans for mainstreaming scaling. And we expect to have worked with some 20 funders by the end of this year. And we'll report on the findings, initial findings of our first year's work at the annual conference of the Scaling Community of Practice in March. Let me stop here, Masood, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Johannes. So that putting it in context, but also telling us a little bit more about where the funders stand. Now, just help me and others understand a bit what your definition of funders is in this. What kinds of organizations are we talking about here?
That's a very good question. Actually, we've deliberately, after some discussion, we've cast our net very widely. So it includes the typical official multilateral and bilateral organizations. So we've been working with GIZ, with Agence Française de Développement. It includes the International Financial Institution, working with IFAD, but also now with African Development Bank. It includes foundations. So we're working with a couple of foundations, Syngenta Foundation. It includes some of the large international NGOs, CRS and CARE. And it includes some research-oriented foundations that fund research and development. So it's a very broad. We have not yet, and probably won't as part of this study, focus on private investors and funders. That's a somewhat separate topic, but it's basically a very broad range of official funders, of funders in the sort of the broad non-private sector.
Right, great. No, that's super helpful. And is it also the case that in your community, your 4,000 participants in your community of practice for this, would you say the majority of the universe of funders are engaged in that community, or do they sort of see this as something that sits a little bit outside? How actively are they participating in this conversation?
Well, one has to be careful here, because actually our community practice is a community of individuals, and it's not so much community organizations, which I think in one way is its strength. We do have some funders who are active supporters, financial supporters actually, of the community practice, but that so far is a relatively small number. Among our members or participants, among the 4,000, I would say maybe a quarter, 20% to a quarter is maybe from funding organizations. But actually many, 70% in recent events that we've organized, around 70% of the participants are actually from the Global South, sort of recipients or actors in one way or another from the Global South. So we're actually very happy that the community practice is now becoming a community practice very much based on and, discussing and bringing in the experience from the bottom up, as Isabel stresses.
Right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
John, could I turn to you a little bit? And as we were saying before, in some ways, as grassroots and other organizations move along the transformation process that leads to scaling up, it's not obvious how clear the path or the milestones are going to be at the beginning, and evaluating impact and doing it not just at the beginning and at the end, but along the way becomes very key. So any thoughts you have on this whole concept of the part of the book that deals with evaluation would be great to bring into that.
Thanks so much, Masood. And I want to give hats off to Isabel and Siddhant and Jossie for writing a wonderful book. I was touched how personal the preface is. It says, like, if you're reading this book, chances are you want to change the world. And that commitment to scaling and like catalyzing successful innovation, seeing kind of local action, local actors being at the center of it and how they could expand their work is just very motivating. I'll echo what Johannes said, is like the book provides a clear framework and almost like a how-to manual for approaching scaling. It builds on Johannes's work and Larry Cooley's work, but it also brings in like these perspectives of economics, social entrepreneurship, the private sector, organizational development, systems thinking. And I think what really makes the book special as well is the perspectives of organizations in low and middle income countries who are leading this work. So, BRAC and Pratham, and highlighting, education reform in Sobral in Brazil. And it adds like a pragmaticism and sensibility to the book because it's really, grounded in those experiences. And so I also agree with Johannes that it's both approachable and clear, but also nuanced and insightful. And to Masood's point, it's, treating scale as something that's inherently complex, involves, working at large scale in new, evolving, and unpredictable contexts. And so it strikes a wonderful balance of doing both those things. So part of my role at JPAL is I help to lead a team called Evidence to Scale. And we'll be, using this book together with our regional offices and our partners as a way to develop a common vocabulary and also the insights in the book to apply it to our work. So Masood, I'll try to make just a couple of points that resonated with me that also touch on the question that you asked. First, I think is not, a theme of the book that comes across very clear, even though, scaling, or even though evaluation is in part 4, is that it's not just something that you do at the end. That like this commitment to evidence, evaluation, and data should be infused throughout the entire scaling process. And that's both because you want to have these iterative feedback loops that improves the model and your understanding of the systems and context, but also so you can clearly communicate impact and progress internally, but also to partners and to funders. And yet, the book notes that like one of the common organizational failures that prevents scaling up is a lack of data and evidence. And so this brings me to my second point that was particularly salient, was that successful organizations, in Isabel's experience, are those that manage to continually use data, evaluation, and evidence to improve their impact. And this, I think, to the point that Isabel kind of queued up, it involves working with a broad set of techniques and methods throughout the scaling process. So both Isabel and I have worked a lot with the nonprofit education organization Pratham in India. And I've worked a lot, on as a partner on Teaching at the Right Level, which is a program to help primary school students who have fallen behind to catch up. And J-PAL's been involved with doing, 7 randomized control trials of the Pratham model, the Teach at the Right Level model over 20 years. We're together helped found an organization called Teach at the Right Level Africa. But when you look at like Pratham, and it really is the leadership and the management's deep curiosity that fuels their learning agenda. It's really core and embedded this curiosity and learning into their DNA. Are we scaling the right model? Can we make it better? Who's benefiting? Who's not? Part of that involves partnering with J-PAL on randomized control trials, but part of it is like many other methods that are more iterative and looking at different systems-based approaches, A/B testing, and developing their own in-house capacity to do this as well to complement the partnerships. And so the book refers to this as adaptive evaluation and highlighting these iterative cycles of experimentation and a mix of qualitative and quantitative. I think this is really important part of scaling. And so I think, Masood, to your question, I think having, confidence in the model that you're scaling, and maybe that some of that confidence can come from things like randomized control trials, but also like noting that you're going to be scaling inside a new system and having lots of understanding of that system and lots of quick iterative feedback loops, given the messiness and nonlinearity of scaling, I think is essential. And my final point is, I think one really important piece, and this, J-PAL, we work a lot in scaling together with governments in low and middle income countries. My perspective from kind of more evidence-based pathways to scaling is this point that Isabel made in her opening, is that scaling involves organizational transformation. And so the organizations that are going to be partners with governments have to develop new sets of skills themselves to be these partners. So if you use the Pratham example again, you go from an organization that was doing, direct implementation, service delivery at a relatively small scale 20 years ago to a bigger scale. Well, that kind of, you develop a set of skills. You need to develop a set of skills. So her step 4 is, kind of building this foundation of HR and finance. But, when you move from direct implementation to like scaling, particularly through public sector systems, it's kind of like that old adage when people take on new management or leadership jobs. It's like what got you here won't get you there. And the skills needed to work with governments, the tremendous progress given their tremendous promise given like their scale, the large networks, but they can be slow moving, hierarchical. There's complex principal agent problems, political cycles. And so the types of skills that partners like Pratham need to develop to be able to work together with governments it requires fundamentally organizational transformation. And I think that point is very salient through the book. And maybe, one final thought related, which Isabel also touched on, is this idea of, when you're collaborating with governments, are you scaling, and you're scaling through the government systems, how much is it, enhancing and refining what government's already doing, and how much of it is trying to be a partner into changing systems and reapproaching problems completely differently. And so scaling within the government versus changing systems is another theme that comes up throughout the book that I think deserves a lot of reflection. So I'll stop there, and hats off to the authors of the book.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. That certainly gives us a lot of insights. Can I just ask you one question before moving on to Veronica,
Please.
which is, one of the things that we found about when you look at large established organizations, governments, or multilateral institutions, or even big foundations, there's a commitment to evidence and a commitment to making sure that what they do is driven by evidence. But often what you find is that the group of people that are involved in the generation of that evidence on what works, what doesn't work, and doing the evaluations sort of sit somewhere in the organization. And then there's the group of people who are actually doing the operational work, if you like. Yeah. And the mainstreaming of the process by which the lessons from the evaluation are fed into the operational decisions that are being made is often the weak link that prevents us from making the kind of changes that you need. Yeah. And I wonder whether, in a way, there's an issue about scaling up of the use of evidence.
Yes.
Which is itself a problem. And to what extent do you, I mean, does that resonate with your experience? Do you think that as we think about scaling up, how can we ensure that the grassroots organizations don't end up all creating a small evidence unit, which sort of sits alongside and talks to each other in other organizations, but doesn't really have an impact on the process? So any thoughts on that? Quick reactions on that?
Yeah, quick reaction. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And you see it, in multilateral institutions as well. The analytical units are often quite separate from the operational ones. I think, one thing that's really, where we've had some success, and I think, I'm sure Imago and other organizations have as well, is, when you're able to frame the research as kind of R&D, and when the operational side has ownership in determining the questions. So we often will have these embedded evidence labs, but they're situated not with the M&E department, they're situated with the planning department, the finance department. And we're kind of going through processes of asking what are the core questions that they have for the year or 2 years ahead, and then trying to build partnerships with the line departments to answer those questions. But I think that is, and that's probably true in grassroots NGOs. I think the insight of analysis and evidence and data being integrated into management and operations that comes out in the book is just, is really important. And I think you've seen lots of innovations from JPAL, Imago, and other groups over the last few years to try to bring these two sides a little bit closer together.
Thanks. Thank you very much, John. Veronica, come to you last but not least, but I really very much, as I said, it'd be great to get your perspective from both having been in government and also in a multilateral development bank. And in some ways, just listening to the others, one question that would be great to hear from you is, this can be a little bit unsettling, this whole process of being open to change and transformation. And particularly if you're in a large organization where people value certainty and precedence, becomes harder still to think about supporting innovations in ways of doing business that could not, maybe won't work. And then you're penalized for things that go wrong, but aren't rewarded for things that go right. So how do you, in your culture of risk aversion that exists in the established organization, support the kind of transformative processes that scaling up necessarily entails in the grassroots sector? And any thoughts?
Okay, thank you very much, Masood. And first of all, congratulations to Isabel, to Jossie, and to Siddhant for a book that I wish, as I think Johannes said before, was there for a long time. I mean, I was reading it and I was thinking, okay, this is great, the insights. I wish I had them 30 years ago when I was in government, or 15 years ago when I started in the multilaterals. But I am in social sector startups and it's I think that the book has many insights that really help deal with that conundrum between what
Veronica, I think we're having a little bit of issue with, or at least I am having a little bit of issue with your connection. Maybe if you turn your video off, it will improve the quality of the sound. That will help.
Oh, okay, I'll turn off the video.
Great, thank you. Sorry to miss that, but yeah.
It's okay. Is it better now?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. So I was saying that I think that what you were saying is there's a disparity in terms of what the government can do, the rigidities that it have, the some capacities that it doesn't have. The innovation is very difficult in government, and failure is always punished. And then you have the audit and control agencies that are always looking for to punish those who fail. So it doesn't help. But at the same time, I mean, and here I think putting things together, what the book I think brings many insights into is actors, intermediaries from outside that help bridge that. For example, evidence. Evidence is not only important to improve the product, but it's also very good when you are trying to deal with the audit and control agencies. I mean, so this is working. We have done all these studies before, and so you have, in a way, something that helps you prove your point in order to innovate if you are willing to. Also, I mean, intermediaries, like also the funders, like MTBs, are very important to help that bridge, to help create that bridge. For example, in the book, it's in the case of, for example, Progress Oportunidades, that social program that was developed in Mexico, the fact that the World Bank was involved helped bridge the timing that happens, that time of transition from one government to the next. The fact that you have a seal of quality from an international organization helps bridge that. Also, multilateral development institutions can help bridge the confidence, trust gap that exists. Because sometimes, I mean, a community cannot be supportive of a certain political party, but the fact that an organization external is there saying this makes sense can help bring people together. So I think that one key aspect of the book for me is it analyzes very well the who and when, who should be involved and when. So the social organization is very good at the beginning, has the time, it's in love with the problem, whereas governments and funders are in love with the solution, to paraphrase what the book's paraphrases from Johannes and Larry Cooley. I mean, some are involved in love with the problem, some others are in love with the solution. It's important that they are at the beginning, people in love with the problem, because they will have the time to really explore the solutions and hear all the different people involved. And then for scaling up, it's great, you have already a solution. People that are in love with solutions and want to replicate scale come at the in the second phase, and that will be it's very good. So the book has, I think, a lot of value to solve that conundrum that you're posing in terms of assigning the who and when. What is the role of each of the parts so that they are complementary instead of cultures that clash and cannot build something. In the case of the livelihoods organization in India, it's also very clear. I mean, it comes at the second time they create the structures in government to scale up something that had decades in the social sector, in the grassroots being created. And in the middle, you have, for example, UNDP providing the proof of concept. So I think that those examples from real life are very good into showing that there is a time and space for all the different players that are in love with those challenges, but also taking into consideration what are the rigidities and the capacities and what are the best value that each of the components can bring. And I think that's a super key, big take away from the book. Another thing that is not regarding your question, but I also think it's a big thing that I take from the book, it's that it's very eclectic. It's not saying, okay, this is private sector practice, it is high tech, and this is other world that it's smaller, poorer, less technically savvy, and those are two different worlds. I mean, the book shows how you can really take things from one for the other one. You can take some things from the super high-tech organizations and bring them to government to scale up social interventions, or you can take work in the academic to bring it to the funders, and then through them bring it to the organizations. So I think that eclectic aspect of the book, not thinking in silos, but really looking for solutions where they are and bringing them to other areas. I think it's really, really powerful and makes the reading even more interesting for a practitioner. I think it's a book from practitioners, for practitioners, but with the rigor of academics and with a view not only of one country or one region of the world, but with a vision that is much wider. And that helps solve that issue that you were mentioning at the beginning too.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for that. Maybe if you can hear me well, let me just ask you one more question that's sort of related to what you just said. A lot of the process of scaling up in grassroots organization, the point that Isabel made in her opening remarks also, is about kind of bottom-up solutions being expanded to scale. And a lot because the problems that, or many of the problems, don't lend themselves to sort of a top-down solution that comes from some central vision of how to apply a set of instruments or mechanism to deal with the problem. And yet a lot of the traditional organizations, governments and multilateral organizations, to a large extent have been focused on the sort of top-down solutions being expanded at scale. To what extent do you think, from your experience, are they ready and able to transform themselves to be able to support the kinds of bottom-up solutions where they don't necessarily lend themselves to the kind of methodologies and reporting and results frameworks that they internally have and that their own governance demands? So in some ways, it's easier for them to scale out, apply at a larger scale the models that they are using and they've got approval for, rather than to experiment. How do you see that process? And on that, maybe others also will have a view. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, that's, I mean, the incentives, I mean, of the funders is to find projects that are big and with big contracts so that you have fewer problems, right? You have And that is in the nature. At the same time, I think that if we believe that most people working in those organizations are really committed to development, it's true that we have to acknowledge that at the end of the day, if you really want to change lives, improve lives, I mean, we have a debt, and that debt needs to be addressed going a little bit to the smaller scale. And I think that these organizations are thinking about it. That's why we have the IDB lab, which was formerly before for me. Now the World Bank has something, a spin-off from the IFC, also to address this type of smaller things, so that the concern, the challenge is already there, I think, in most organizations. But we need to find a way to do more and more frequently and learn and accelerate that process. But I think that there is a recognition of that situation. For example, it's much easier to build roads, big roads like the Pan American Highway, than it's to fund this small community-based organization for maintenance of rural roads, in which, on the other hand, I mean, governments have sometimes less interest because you don't have a big opening, ribbon cutting ceremonies. So the incentives are a little bit not right. At the same time, I think that, for example, the SDGs and the Millennium Development Goals before are making us realize that we need to do other things in order to improve those indicators. I mean, if you think of SDGs, the rural road project in Peru makes much more impact in many indicators than building another third road in the Panamericana, you know? So I think that the conditions and the fact that we have all these new indicators that show us development are helping change, that are helping make that transition towards projects that are more important in terms of impact than they are in terms of big distribution of money into big projects that at the end up many times being partially white elephants.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we, colleagues, we still have about a little over 15 minutes or so to go. I do want to see if we get any reactions from the 100 and some people that are online as well. But before getting in people to come in with any thoughts on the chat, and I encourage people who do have reactions or questions to post them on the chat, which everyone can see. I want to come back to each of you to just take a minute and see if you've heard anything from your other panelists that you want to react to. And I want to start actually first. Isabel, I was going to come to you at the end, but that's a little too traditional. And I was just wondering whether at this point there was something that you heard that you felt you wanted to come back on as part of the conversation.
Yeah, just briefly, I think for me, this shows that this is a really important conversation to have. I love what I've been hearing, all the very thoughtful comments of each of the panelists, and also your questions, Masood. So I think the objective of the book is, of course, to help people who want to scale up, but also to generate this type of conversations. It's such an important goal, as Johannes was pointing out, it's becoming even more important that to have these thoughtful conversations, I think for me would be a huge part of being successful with the book.
Right. Okay, thank you. Now, and before going to the other panelists, and I see Johannes has got his hand up, I do want to say, Siddhant and Jossie, you're online, aren't you? So is it possible for you to turn your cameras on for a moment? Because I want to ask whether there's anything that you've heard that you either want to react to or violently disagree with. And if so, please come, let us at least have a moment to see if there's any point you want to raise. I mean, I can't see you yet on my screen, but that may be, oh, I do see them now, yeah. So I see Jossie and I see Siddhant. Anything from either of you? Siddhant, anything?
I can say something briefly. So I don't violently, I actually agree and resonate with a lot of what most people have said. I just wanted to briefly respond to an audience question on the role of RCTs and when not to use it. And so and I think John already replied, and I really resonate with his answer already, but I think there is a question of, when to use which tools, right? And I think one of the good parts of the book is that we do try and get into how to think about using which tools, when are RCTs relevant and when are they not. And roughly, and I won't go into too much detail, is, thinking about the question in hand, right? Is it about systems? Is it about context? Is it about effectiveness? Is it about design responsiveness? Those things matter in deciding which tools, but also the stage of scaling up. Is it an early stage? And so for RCTs, for very, very early stage where you're finding the solution, where you're looking at the problem, they may not be the most cost effective. But when you have a model, or as I think John was saying with his Zambia example, in more intermediate stages of scaling, RCTs may be more useful. And then finally, on an important thing to consider is time, cost, and resources, which I think is underappreciated sometimes, but extremely crucial. And so the big message of the book is, to be more open-minded with tools, but also think more carefully about which tool is needed in which stage. And of course, that, evidence is needed throughout. And so to be more mindful of that. So that's just to complement what John was saying, and also an audience question. But I'll hand it over to Jossie.
Thank you very much,
thank you.
Siddhant. Jossie.
Yeah, no, I really agree and resonate with what the panelists share. And I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I think as part of the book, this has been a lot of learning as well, at least for Siddhant and me. And I think especially it resonates with me how the book is about embracing complexity and about how there are many different stakeholders, and about what Veronica said, like how to think when to involve who in the process of scaling up is also important. And in the evidence part, also what I think John was saying, like how to make this different is not as such a separation between researchers and implementers, but how to generate this conversation between them, because this is the way that actually people can learn in the process. And we really consider that this is very important when they're scaling up, especially because it's not about bringing one thing to a different context, like what Johannes was saying at the beginning, that sometimes founders are focused on this. It's more about, if we are going through a new system, a new context, like we really need to do a lot of deep learning before we can start thinking about scaling up. So this whole transformation involves a lot of different perspectives that go beyond like traditional economics perspectives. And I think that is the kind of discussion that we also are trying to generate. So thank you everyone, because I think everyone has brought all these very diverse perspectives that has been wonderful to hear.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jossie. So now let me come back to the panelists and see if they have any things. Johannes, you had your hand up. It's now down, but let me come to you.
Okay, no, I didn't want to interfere. Anyway, I want to come back for a minute to your question that you raised, Masood, which is, how do we get organizations to focus effectively on the bottom up rather than operating top down? And I think in part it's that different organizations have different roles and capacities. I mean, I've been working a lot with IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development in Rome, which is very much focused on actually working in a bottom-up way with farmers' organizations and government, but especially with farmer organizations and smallholder farmer groups. And an excellent example of how they've worked is Peru, actually, where over 15 years they supported a highlands rural development program that expanded dramatically over that 15 years. Ultimately was handed off to the government. It was handed off to the big international multilateral organizations. And I think that's sort of the way I believe we have to think about it. The right organization has to, at the right time, work in this bottom-up way and support the bottom-up process, but then it has to hand off at the right time and in a way that's effectively prepared. So I think this is part of the pathway thinking. It isn't just doing one thing and that's it. It's, we have to think about the role an organization and even individuals within an organization play along the pathway, and then be ready to hand off in an effective and well-prepared way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I think that's a really important point. The willingness and culture of organizations where they're ready to hand off something that they have incubated and developed up to a point where they feel now this would either be better off as a freestanding organization or as a part of some other organization, whether in this case it goes to government, as you're saying, is something that I think doesn't exist as often as it should. And organizations become very attached to whatever initiative they develop, and particularly if it looks like it's being successful, they'd rather hold on to it than let it be even more successful somewhere else. So I'm very glad that you raised it. And actually, I would just say that applies as much to research organizations and as it does to anybody else at that point. Veronica, I think I have your hand is up, so I'll come to you first and then John. Yeah.
Yes, I want to add something regarding the question that you posed about how can the founders multilateral work and help scaling up, and link it to the chapter on social enterprises. And I think that there's an important role for governments to change the policies for procurement so that helps scale up, helps organizations to be able to scale up by being able to procure and sell to governments. Also, for example, in topics like regulatory framework for finance and banking, when we're thinking about fintechs and banking inclusion, or in terms of regulations for the labor markets. So where there's a role to play by governments, but also by multilateral development organizations to help make that transition to frameworks of policy that are more favorable for scaling up. I think that's an important role that I wanted to highlight.
Thank you very much, Veronica. No, that is an important point. Now, there's one question about in the chat that it'd be great if you could look at from John Hicklin, and who's asking about whether one could use the discussion about reforming corporate governance. And I assume, John, you're referring to corporate governance in the private sector, or could this be a way to use the private sector that has well-trodden way to scale up, or is this too far away from social enterprises? So there's a question there if anybody wants to come to that. But before doing that, John, was there anything you wanted to add? Sorry, not John Hicklin. I'm talking to John Floretta.
Oh, thanks, Masood. Maybe just this, this little bit, my own experience, and I think a point that's made in the book and the other panelists have made as well, is that the role of collaboration in scaling up, with having civil society partners and government and researchers, the most effective scaling projects that I've been a part of through government channels have involved kind of those early multiple actors at the early stage, but then with clear ownership over time of, if it's going to be a government or public sector pathway, it has to have government ownership. It has to be their program. So it's I think it's like anything else, you want to be a good partner to make things easier. And there's a very fine line where if you step too far in being a good partner and making it easier, you're not seeing that ownership and sustainability. And I think it's a really tricky issue, but it's just something that's been on my mind in this conversation.
Thank you very much, John. And actually, it's linked a little bit to a question that Rakesh has just posed in the chat, which is, how does one think about what is the importance of the relationship with, you say, Rakesh, government leaders, but you could also broaden that out to be leaders whose engagement and ownership of the agenda is essential to move it forward. How does this come about? So maybe this is a good moment, Isabel, for me to come back to you a little bit to respond to that question, but also to the question that John Hicklin made, because we didn't really have anybody in the panel today from the private sector perspective in some ways. It'd be great to get your take from a bit on that chapter as well.
Great. So on the government, that's a really important question on the trust. And I think through our work, we're scaling up a couple of innovations from social enterprises, another from SEWA through the government. We were also involved a little bit with, John mentioned, with TARL Africa. I think that, first of all, the government is not a monolithic, and we have to understand that there's some government officials, especially at the front line and local government, who are very frustrated with their incapacity to actually affect change. And so that trusted relationship of, first of all, understanding their own system, what do they need to deliver, and what do you need to help them protect from the audits and the things that Veronica was mentioning. And so in our work, what we have discovered is that bringing in the government in the livelihoods, for example, SRLM, State Livelihood Mission, bringing in the government as one of the stakeholders that very much needs to be part of this mapping of a system, understanding it, seeing what are the pathways, and little by little being part of this co-creative process. I think that trust is developed through bringing all these players together, and for organizations in the grassroots to understand that things are not as simple when you're scaling up through the government as when you're scaling up as an organization independent of the government. So that trust is generated through on-the-job discovery of the pathways to scale. On the question about corporate governance, I didn't understand it, John. Maybe you can explain it a little bit. I think the reason that we worked with Unilever when we were trying to scale, I accompanied Solar Sisters. The Unilever really wanted to scale this. And my understanding of the reason that the private sector failed is because their efforts to get to the base of the pyramid were almost like within a sort of corporate social responsibility arm of the company, rather than aligning very much with what the company wanted to do in terms of profit maximization. And so that's for me is what I have understood has been the failure. So I don't know how bringing in corporate governance would help, but maybe you can help me understand the question a bit better.
Okay, let's see.
Is John still around?
John Hicklin. No, don't see anything from John. All right, well, we'll come back to that offline. I think what I would like to do at this stage is to really try and bring this to a close by thanking, I really think this has been a very important and useful session. Oh, somebody's just come into the chat to say, terrific session, really looking forward to reading the book. Well, there you go. I think that is a very good note on which to try to bring it to closure. But I want to thank, obviously, the three co-authors, Isabel and also Siddhant and Jossie, and then our panelists, Johannes and John and Veronica, for their really thoughtful insights and comments, and for the active participation of those of you who have been contributing through the chat. And this will continue, no doubt, with more discussion, including, Johannes, you said you have in March your annual conference, perhaps at some
right
point.
Yeah, and actually we'll have another session very much of relaunching, whatever is the right term, with Isabel and the team, and we look forward to that discussion. It'll probably focus on slightly different angles from today, but yes, you're all very welcome to join in March.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everyone. Great start to the year.
Thank you, Masood.